as we say goodbye to TVAM, good morning and welcome to the very last day of transmission from Thames Television.
This is the TV Booth Podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the TV Booth Podcast with me, Rob Francis. Today's guest is best known as a continuity announcer and newsreader for various ITV regions. His voice has introduced the final day of transmissions for Thames Television, as well as schedule changes in the days following the September 11th attacks in New York. I'm pleased to welcome Mark Lipscomb into the TV Booth.
Hello, I'm Mark Lipscomb and you're listening to the TV Booth Podcast.
Mark, thank you for agreeing to be a part of the TV Booth Podcast.
My pleasure, Rob. At long last, we finally get to do it.
Finally, you will not believe the amount of technical problems we've had this afternoon in getting this podcast going, but I think we're now there. So let's start at the beginning, Mark. When did you first decide that you wanted to work in television?
That goes right back to my childhood, actually, Rob. When I was a little boy, I was absolutely obsessed with wanting to become a TV cameraman. To the extent that when my parents used to go up to school for meetings with the teachers around careers times, they would say, we're really a bit worried about Mark because he doesn't want to work in a shop or doesn't want to become an accountant or, the sort of normal jobs. He wants to work in TV. And they said, don't think he will ever do it. So it goes right back to my childhood, desperately wanting to be a television cameraman. And it went from there, actually.
How did your career in television begin?
Well, because I wanted to fulfill the ambition of being a cameraman, while I was at school, I would always go around to visit the TV studios, ITV, BBC, and I lived in the South. So I often went down to Southern Television's Dover studio, and which was brilliant, a wonderful place for those people that might have had memories of it, and also down to Southampton. And all the television cameramen that I met, the heads of cameras and departments, said, you've got to get photographic experience and you've got to go to college. So I angled my sort of school career with subjects to go to college. It was very difficult to get in, but I was very lucky because one of the cameramen at Thames Television gave me a wonderful reference, which I think might have swayed it a bit. And because it was heavily oversubscribed, the course. I got into the course. It was a 3-year course, but after the second year, I was offered a trainee camera position at one of the London facilities companies called Molyneux at the time. And it was a great time to start as a trainee because Channel 4 had just started. We were doing lots of studio live programs for ITV, Channel 4, lots of outside broadcasts. So it was a great place to start. So that's where my TV career started, but on the other side of camera.
So how did you go from that to continuity announcing?
Well, I gather I'm quite unique in that respect. The only other person I've ever known who's done that was Alan Cartner, who was the continuity announcer at Border Television a few years ago. He used to be a television cameraman for BBC outside broadcasts, and when I met him, we had that in common. And I understand it's quite rare for people to go from one side of the camera to the other. But basically, what happened was that after a while of being freelance as a cameraman, I decided I might want some other string to my bow. And it was around the time when the franchises were coming up in 92, and a lot of the companies were possibly going to lose their franchise, so they'd be making a lot of redundancies. So I thought this would be a good time to try and get another string to my bow. And something else I'd always wanted to do as a young kid was to be on the radio or TV as a presenter. In fact, when I was young, I actually built my own sort of continuity studio in my dad's loft, and I would sit there with different company logos over my shoulder with a pretend camera. As sad as that might sound, but I'm sure it hits a note with many people out there. And I used to sit there.
Not alone there, Mark.
I used to sit there for ages doing my own continuity announcements. So that aside, I then saw an advert for the AA Road Watch. They wanted new traffic reporters because at the time they were providing traffic reports for independent local radio and BBC. So I sent off a tape and they asked me to go along, and I did an audition and I got some work along with Fiona Phillips at the time, who went on to be a presenter at GMTV, and Trish Bertram, who was an announcer at LWT. So we would go in there really early in the morning sometimes, talking about, traffic chaos, hold-ups on the motorways, our eyes sort of half closed because we were still quite asleep. But it was a great place to start. And at the time, one of the companies that we did a broadcast to was BBC World Service. And before the actual broadcast, we'd contact the studio manager and make sure the lines were okay and they could hear us and we could hear them. And after I did one of the broadcasts, this particular studio manager said to me, Mark, have you ever thought about coming to work for the World Service? And I said, oh my gosh, World Service, I actually put that on a pedestal. And she said, we're looking for new trainee announcers and newsreaders. So she said, why don't you, send them a tape and see how it goes? So I did. And I understand, along with 2,500 other people, I applied, and I was one of 5 lucky people to be accepted and taken on to be trained as a newsreader and an announcer for about 9-10 months. That was. So that was great experience getting the live radio stuff. Prior to that, I'd spoken to the ITV companies saying, I would really like to have a go at being an announcer, and do you take trainees on? And they all said to me the same thing. You need to go and get some radio experience and some live broadcasting experience. So after I'd been at the BBC World Service, I contacted TVS, as it was at the time, and they said, well, we're so impressed that you actually did what we suggested. We'd like to take you on as a trainee. So I joined TVS in 1987 and was trained by people like Malcolm Brown, who was former of Granada and who was then head of announcers at TVS. Trish Bertram, again, who was there working at TVS and LWT. So I had some really great people to learn from. And I was at TVS for a couple of years, freelancing and learning the ropes. And then one day, the deputy head of press, who was an absolutely wonderful man called John Gordon, said to me one day, Mark, have you ever thought of working at Thames? And I said, oh gosh, Thames was in London. It was one of the big franchises. And he said, I really think you ought to contact the head of press at Thames and send them a tape. So I did. They called me in for a chat. I spent a day sitting with Philip Elsmore, who I'm sure your listeners will know is one of the voices of Thames, and he'd been there for a number of years. So I sat next to him for a day, watching him work. And at the time, the announcers were still very much in vision at Thames. So sat next to him and then did a couple of links out of vision during the day. And then the next day, the head of press called me and said, have you got your diary? I'd like to book you for some work. And there I stayed to the end of the franchise. So
absolutely, yes, because you were the announcer on the final day of Thames Television. I'd like to ask about that, actually, because it must have been a very difficult day for you that day. What was the atmosphere like?
Well, I have to say, Rob, when we actually heard that we'd lost the franchise, which was a good 18 months previous to it actually happening, it was like slowly watching a huge dinosaur die, because you'd go into the Euston Studios where the presentation was based, and over a period of weeks and months, offices would suddenly have closed down. People were suddenly leaving. And so what had been a vast factory of television for ITV was gradually dying on its feet. And I have to say, it was very difficult for me, because I was offered a job at Carlton before Thames lost the franchise. Right. So from the September of 1993 up until the franchise changed, I was going across to the studios at LWT where Carlton's transmission was going to be based. under the LNN umbrella, and we were doing rehearsals and training to get this new station on air. And then I'd be going back to the Euston Studios of Thames in the afternoon to do an evening shift. I was going forward, but so many of my colleagues were not. And for so many of them, it was the end of their careers, and it was a very, very difficult time. As for the last day, I was on the daytime shift. Coming out of TVAM, which themselves were closing that day, and Philip Elsmore was doing the evening shift. It was a very emotional day, probably one of the most emotional days I've experienced in my working career. I stayed right through to the evening, and I filmed on video a lot of behind the scenes footage of what was going on that night, and I did put some of them on Twitter last Christmas time, but there's more at some point I need to do. But it was, and even now, Rob, when I watch this video back, it brings tears to my eyes. It really does, because it was such an emotional day, such a poignant day, because from then on, ITV was never the same.
No, I will agree with that. I mean, you've left Thames, and you've now joined Carlton. So yes. How did things progress from there?
Well, Carlton was a very different beast, as it were. It was always going to have a difficult job following in the footsteps of Thames, which had been there for 20 odd years. So Thames had a history. Carlton was a completely new experience. It wasn't a broadcaster as such, where it made its own programs. It was a publisher broadcaster, so whereby a lot of their material was made by independents. It was a very different experience because we were based at the South Bank studios where LWT were. So I felt we were very much like tenants living in somebody else's house. We were up on the 6th floor in presentation. But the main actual hub of Carlton was based in St Martin's Lane and then in Knightsbridge. So we were very much split apart from the mothership, as it were. And so we were there, as I say, doing our Monday to Friday till 5:15, and then LWT would take over, and we literally hot seat in the same announcer's booth. We'd get up, and the LWT announcer would get in and take over. So in that respect, Carlton was a very different beast to Thames. And in fact, I, having been at Thames for a number of years, it was very difficult, because you sort of almost go into automatic sometimes when you're doing announcements. And for some time, once I started at Carlton, I had to have a piece of paper in front of me saying, "This is Carlton," because I was so worried that one day I was going to say, "This is Thames."
Yeah, a pound in the swear box.
Yeah, I think a lot more than that, actually. Yes.
Yeah, I take it around the time you joined Central, they were under Carlton control. How did you get involved? I actually joined Central in 1991 while I was still at Thames, and of course, working for the weekday contractor, it was Monday to Friday, so I had my weekends off. So Central were looking for an additional presenter for their weekend bulletins in the Central South setup. I don't know if you're aware, but Central at the time was split up into 3 news regions. There was the South in Abingdon, then we had the Birmingham setup and the Nottingham setup. So I went for an audition to do news reading at Central South at weekends and got the job. So I was lucky. I was busy at Thames during the daytime and weekdays, and then at weekends I would trot up to Abingdon and present. But it was, Central was a great place to work, because Central South was, I think, probably one of the best, and I would say that, wouldn't I? But it was one of the best news regions, I think. It covered such a diverse area, from sort of Oxfordshire right into Herefordshire, and even now people come up and say we really miss Central South, because it did cover the region. And I was given great opportunities at Central by the management, because I went and did daytime presenting bulletins in Birmingham, and then programmed the 6 o'clock program in Nottingham. So it was a great place to work. Excellent. I mean, I remember watching you when Central South became Thames Valley Today, because
Oh, yeah.
I'm in the Thames Valley area. So remember watching you on Sunday evenings reading the news. It was always a joy to listen to your voice reading the news.
Thank you.
What is a day in the life of a typical continuity announcer? What sort of jobs do you have to carry out in a shift?
Well, I have to say, I don't know what it's like now, Rob, particularly in ITV, but at the time, the day was split up into three shifts. There would be the daytime announcer. We would be there to bring the station on air, at 9:25 until children's ITV. Then the evening announcer would come in until about 10:30, and after news at 10, the junction, and then there'd be a nighttime announcer who would go through the night, back round to TVAM as it was in the day at 6 o'clock. So I did quite a lot of evening shifts at Thames. So that would mean being in, as I said, after children's ITV. We would go in, we would get our schedules from the presentation director. We would go through any pointers that we might need to make. Anything we'd have a chat about what the evening was going to bring forward. So you would we'd have program synopses about what was going on. And I think one of the main jobs of an announcer is to really know what your programs are. It's very easy to read a script and say this is. But I think the viewers feel far more engaged if you are engaged with the program, and they get a sense that you've been watching it with them. And at the time, as I say, I don't know what it's particularly like now, but we wrote all our own scripts. So everything was, done by us. The occasional script would come down, say, for example, if we had to do an ITC adjudication, if someone had made some defamatory comment on a program, where we'd have the ITA the ITC as it was at the time would have an adjudication, so we would have to read that out. But most of all the other scripts that we did in introing programs was written by ourselves. So we would stay on until, as I say, after the news at 10:30 local news junction, and then the nighttime announcer would come in, and we would hand over to them. So yeah, it was great. One of the best jobs I've ever had. I have to say, one of the best jobs I've ever had. And if you're a TV anorak, it makes it even better.
Absolutely. One of the clips that I found on YouTube recently was of you doing a continuity announcement on the day of the September the 11th terrorist attacks. You were doing a schedule change, was broadcast nationally.
Yes.
How did you cope with schedule changes? Were they easy to slot into the schedule?
Well, I have to say, Rob, I always liken the job of an announcer and a presenter. Actually, you have to be very much like a swan. You're very calm and cool on the surface. Underneath, your feet could be paddling like mad because all around you is changing. And I have to say, that's when an announcer and a presenter earns their money, when things are changing at such a fast pace. And I remember I was at home on the day of 9/11 during the daytime, and just getting ready actually to leave to go to work, and I had my television on, and saw the dreadful goings on with the Twin Towers, and obviously got to work as quick as I could, because it was an unfolding situation and things were changing so rapidly. ITN were doing, as they called it, open ender, whereby they go on air and just carry on until they've given as much information as possible. But at the same time, the schedule was changing in other ways, so it was changing as we were on air, which was great. And so what we had to do was a lot of network announcements at the time. We would have a 30-second rundown saying, due to circumstances and events in America today, program changes are like this, and that means we're going to be joining ITN at such a time. And that's when the adrenaline rushes through your veins, and that's when you really earn your money, because you've really got to be on the ball. And it was, I have to say, like that when Diana, Princess of Wales, died. Big events changes everything in television, and you've got to be prepared and you've got to deliver That's the main thing. So it was exciting because and I also remember being on at Thames when the first Gulf War started. And that was just incredible because my controller presentation came in late at night, and they were literally rewriting the ITV schedule as they were going along, and they were doing lives into ITN, and it's when you see that part of the ITV machinery kicking in, you just think, wow, this is something really quite special. Because at times like that, they deliver, and they're there for the public to know what's going on. And you just, at the time, I stood back and I thought, this is just incredible to watch this happening.
Follow the TV Booth podcast on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube for sneak previews of forthcoming podcasts. This is the TV Booth podcast.
What would you say was your proudest moment?
I'm proud of everything I've done in television, be it camera work, be it continuity announcing, be it presenting Central, presenting the news, and at Thames Valley. Oh gosh, I think I probably have to say on days like 9/11 and Diana's death, when you get home and you realise the extent of what has actually happened that day, and you know that what you broadcast went out to the nation or to the region, wherever you were, and you provided that service and it went as clockwork, that's when you'd come home and actually almost tap yourself on the back, patted yourself on the shoulder and thought, yes, that worked. It did. We did it. So I think those are amongst some of my most proud moments, and achieving, a life-held ambition really to work in TV.
Were there any bloopers or outtakes or any cock-ups that happened whilst you were on duty?
There's been a few actually, Rob, but one that does spring to mind is when I was at Thames. When I joined, it was very much in the time when they were gradually phasing out in vision during the daytime and evening. But you had to go prepared, looking the part, ready just in case something happened or they decided they were going to do an in-vision slot. And it was the day that Laurence Olivier died. We were in a programme in the afternoon, and suddenly we had a call from ITN to say that Laurence Olivier had died and that they would be doing a news flash. Now, Laurence Olivier had done quite a lot of programmes for Thames over the latter years, so I was aware that the management, were going to be upstairs watching this. But at the time when I was at Thames, we had talkback between the announcer and the presentation director, but it was keyed talkback, and by that I meant they pushed a button and you could hear them. We didn't wear earpieces or headphones. And we were in the middle of this program and I was sitting there, and suddenly over the talkback, my presentation director said, we're doing a news flash at ITN at, I think it was 3:00. And we're going to be going to Trevor McDonald for a news flash. And then suddenly the lights came on in the studio and he said, coming to you, coming to you, coming to you. And suddenly I looked at my preview monitors and my transmission monitor and I was on air.
Oh dear.
And thinking, right, now I remember he said we're going to ITN at 3:00 for the news flash. So I started talking, but nothing was coming out because they hadn't faded my microphone up.
Oh dear.
So I'm sort of sitting there goldfishing, saying, and then suddenly they must have realised out in the control room, oh my gosh, his microphone isn't up. So they put the microphone up. And I said, we'll be joining Children's ITV in a couple of minutes. First, we're going over to ITN for a news flash, as it was at the time, a news flash. Anyway, we went across to ITN. I think it was Trevor McDonald presenting the news flash. By the time we switched over to ITN, my lights went out. And it was like, what happened there? I must have looked like a frightened rabbit in the headlights. But by that time, my presentation director had been summoned upstairs to answer by management, what the hell happened there? And it was after that, because I said to them, if I'd have had an earpiece, I would have known what was going on. And after
Yeah.
that, we had earpieces. So it's one of those days that you never forget. I've got the tape somewhere, and when I do find it, I'm sure there's plenty of people that would like to see it.
I'm sure a lot of people would like to see it. Brilliant. Well, recently on Twitter, you've been rather vocal about the centralisation of continuity and the erosion of the regional station identities. What's your view on it, on all these changes that have been made over the last 20 years?
Well, I guess I'm sort of old-fashioned in many respects, Rob, because I loved the ITV regions. ITV was set up, in to be so unique amongst broadcasters. And I think I find it really sad that we've lost that. I understand why it was done on a business in a business basis and a financial basis, but I think it's really sad that ITV has lost something that made it so unique, probably in the world, whereby wherever you went in the country, you knew you were watching your local TV programs that were made in that region and actually reflected the diverse makeup that that this country, the British Isles, is. And I think I find it really sad that we've lost that now. It's been, for want of a better expression, homogenized, where this one size fits all approach, which to me doesn't distinguish ITV from any other broadcaster now. Okay, you've still got regional news on ITV, and you've got regional news on the BBC. But as far as ITV is concerned, and the BBC, they are all very much the same. They've got the same sets, they've got the same theme music. Whereas once upon a time, if you watch Coast to Coast in the TVS region, or About Anglia, you knew you were watching something really unique from those regions. And I'm sad that we've lost that. And actually now, this week we hear the announcement from Ofcom that they've allowed Global Radio to do very much the same, and to mirror some of the ITV regions, to have an Anglia, a Meridian, and a Southwest region. So we've actually lost the local in ILR as well now, which I think,
it's a shame.
It is a shame. It's a great shame. I would love to believe that one day someone would think, what goes on in this country is so different in different parts of the British Isles. You'd watch some wonderful documentaries and local programs made in the Southwest, some of their traditions, so different to what was going on in the Tyne Tees regions. And as soon as those different company logos came up, probably because I was a bit of an anorak, but I'd say, oh my gosh, this is a different part of this country, and we learned so much from it. So I would love to believe it would come back, but who knows? Never say never, but
anything can happen.
Indeed.
You've seen many different channel identities come and go. What would you say was your favourite channel identity of all time?
My favourite channel identity of all time? Well, I suppose I'm going to be biased. I've got to say Thames, the original Thames ident, where it splits over the river and the reflection. That's known world over. Secondly, and very closely followed by Southern, because I grew up in the Southern area, and ATV. I guess I'm a bit of a traditionalist, actually, Rob, when it comes to idents. I like to see a nice logo and a symbol, because I think they were more flexible for announcers. They were great tools to use. And I have to say, at this point, congratulations to Matt Scarf and the ITV Creatives team, because I think they've done a great job with the new ITV idents. At last, we've got an ITV symbol, which I think which is absolutely great. I mean, I think going back a few years, when the franchises changed in 92 or 93, as it were, I think probably, and I know one of your listeners will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Carlton were the first company to actually have live action idents with people in them. I don't know if you know the answer to that. I'm pretty sure I'm right. Is that right, do you think?
Yeah, I reckon you're right there. But if anybody would like to correct me and you, please get in touch and tell us, because We'd like to
Yes,
hear about it.
I think the BBC might have had the balloons and the rest, the
And that
dancers.
was late,
But
I think. Yeah, that was later. That was 97.
was
So
it?
Carlton launched the People Idents when they launched in 93. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah,
So, I mean,
they were really good. But I think yes, as I say, I think Carlton were the first ITV company to have live action idents. But it's also, as I say, I'm a real traditionalist. I like to see a station clock because again, that was a great tool for announcers, particularly if things went wrong. You could put the clock up, and it was a great piece of tool for us to use, especially into news. But I know the argument's been since digital that you can't have a clock because there's a delay, and it can be sometimes like 40 odd seconds. But I'm glad to see that the BBC, the new BBC Scotland channel, has introduced a clock into their
yeah.
9 and 7 news, which is really, really, really interesting. But of course, even though we've got digital TV and digital radio, we still get the Pips and Big Ben on Radio 4. So perhaps the argument doesn't necessarily go. Um, but as I say, I'm a real traditionalist for idents, and I think it's really interesting and great that the American idents, the American networks, the ABCs, the NBCs, and CBSs, they've basically kept the same idents for 70 plus years. And I just think that's fantastic because I think that shows great strength and belief in your brand. And if you're changing your idents every, few years, I think that sort of puts a bit of question over what you actually believe your product is like. So, I mean, hats off to the American networks.
What are your thoughts on the current state of television presentation?
Well, as I say, I think Matt Scarf and the ITV Creatives team have done a marvelous job with these new idents. I think there's one new one every week for the rest of 2019. It's good not to see a live action, people ident. I'd love to see Channel 4 bring back their ident because it's so iconic. They've used it on some of their promos and variations for their other channels like More 4 and Plus 4. But I wish someone would take the the real step and say that's our brand, that's what we're recognized for, the colourful 4 logo, and let's bring it back. I like Fives. I like Fives' use of the figure 5 into their brake bumpers. I'm not so keen on their idents.
What do you think? What do you think of the BBC idents at the moment?
I love the new BBC Two look. I think that's a real refreshing look, and it's kept a stylized too. As for BBC One, oh gosh, what can you say
Yeah.
about that? I just think for the national broadcaster, they are pretty awful. Understated. And nothingness. I don't know about oneness, but they're nothingness. What I can, I sort of get what they did, oneness and bringing everyone together with BBC One, but that was okay for a short campaign. But it must be on for about 2 years now, surely. I mean, what was wrong with the Globe? It's just fabulous. You can update it gradually. Bring back the Globe, I say, for BBC One as the national broadcaster. Bring back the Globe. Bring back the Globe. And I just hope that, after this year has finished with the ITV idents every different one every week, I hope they stick with a logo because I don't think you can beat a logo. I'm a traditionalist, yes, but I think live action idents have had their day. They're so samey and gimmicky. You can't beat a logo ident. That's why all the ITV regional idents were so fabulous and so well loved. You saw the ident and you thought, that's my station. The Westward Galleon, the ATVI, and of course the Anglia Knight. Wow, fabulous.
I collect TV memorabilia. I run Ident Central, so I've got so many images, so many videos, so many interesting things in my archive. What's your archive like? Do you have an archive of memorabilia from television?
I have, Rob, actually, quite an extensive one. I call it the TV memorabilia cupboard, actually, because every time I'm going into different cupboards and areas, I'm finding more surprise treasures that I sometimes put up on different Facebook pages. Yeah, I'm a real TV memorabilia fanatic actually, and I'm sure friends over the years have thought, oh God, he's a bit round the twist. But yeah, I've got some great things. I've got a lot of end boards, the production caption boards, umbrellas coming out of. I mean, if one day I'm going to sit in front of all these umbrellas with a photograph, because umbrellas from all the TV stations, and I've also got one of my two prized possessions, the final Thames logo that used to be hang behind the announcer on night times when you saw them in vision.
Oh, yeah.
I've got that.
Yeah.
And I think my prize possession is the foundation stone from the Southern Television Studios in Southampton. So, I mean, sadly, I can't put the foundation stone in the house because it's too big and too heavy. It took 3 people to actually put it into a car. Do you know the amazing thing about getting that foundation stone, Rob, was that it was actually taken out of the studios on the 40th anniversary that it was laid.
Wow.
And it wasn't until I got home, I looked at the date and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, it's 40 years to the day that this stone was laid, and 40 years to the day later that I took it away. Unbelievable.
So let's look into the future. How do you think that television presentation is going to change over the next 10 years?
Well, I think without doubt, we're going to have a lot more streaming, and the traditional idea of people sitting in front of a TV for 4 or 5 hours a day, watching 1 or 2 channels and watching what was presented to them is probably going to disappear to a large extent, because people can now create their own schedules almost by watching, Netflix or Amazon Prime or any of these streaming channels. And of course, ITV and the BBC have now come together with BritBox. So there's going to be more reason for people to pick and choose what they want to watch. So in that respect, the traditional sort of, as I say, viewing, I think, will change. I can see a time when maybe even live continuity announcing will disappear. And so much of it will be pre-recorded, which again, is very sad, and I always sort of cringe when I hear pre-recorded continuity, because on some channels, I mean, if I watch ITV3 sometimes, we'll have the same intro on the buses every day for 3 weeks, or and you just think, oh, it's going to be down at the depot, the same thing. And I don't think viewers like that.
No, it's just, it doesn't feel as personal as doing it live, in my opinion.
No, and I think we us as humans, we like to feel we belong somewhere, and that's another thing that I would say about the loss of the ITV regions as we knew it. Of course, they still exist in a franchise form, but people like to feel they belong to a region. I mean, look at how Granada Land suddenly became, almost a part of the UK map. Big areas of the country were known because of their TV companies, and we like to feel that we belong to it. We like to go past a studio and see the flag flying and say, oh wow, that's my TV station. And that again, I think we've really lost. And people, that connection with the public has gone. That more intimate sort of, we're your station, and because again, it's a sort of a one size fits all approach, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay.
So let's find out what you're up to now, because I mean, I take it you're not working in television as much anymore. So what are you up to at the moment?
Well, I'm doing voiceovers, a lot of podcasts for clients, and narrating of company videos, that sort of thing. I'm also doing training if people want to do television presentation training, and presenting company corporate videos. So in the corporate market, so it's very different. There's no sort of immediacy with the corporate market. They are very different beasts. but at least I get the chance to use my skills. And of course, always love to get back into TV broadcasting in some way. So, let's see what happens. Never say never.
Absolutely. Mark, it has been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for being a guest on the TV Booth podcast.
Thanks very much indeed, Rob. Thanks a lot.
My thanks to Mark Lipscomb for a fantastic chat and a great insight into the world of being a continuity announcer. Thank you for listening to the podcast, and a particular thank you for the great feedback received following my first podcast with Erin Gordon a few weeks ago. The response has been fantastic, and I do hope that you will continue to follow the podcast in the future. Don't forget, you can visit our website, tvboothpodcast.co.uk, for more information. You can subscribe to our Facebook, Twitter, YouTube and Instagram feeds for upcoming show news. And I will be back with another podcast very soon. So for now, goodbye. And don't forget to switch off your devices before you go to bed tonight.
The TV Booth podcast is hosted by Rob Francis. Copyright 2019.